This little video is showing us how to name inorganic compounds. So this is a little foldable that I've made here. Looking at step 1, it says to identify the individual parts. So whenever you're given a compound, you're given it either in metal plus nonmetal form, metal plus polyatomic, or nonmetal plus nonmetal form. So when you're given it in a metal plus a nonmetal, it is an ionic compound. It's considered an ionic compound. And in order to name that ionic compound, if you're dealing with a soft metal, that is, any of those in group 1 and group 2 are soft metals of the periodic table, you would simply name the soft metal first, followed by a nonmetal ending in IDE. So for example, sodium chloride. If we're dealing with a heavy metal plus a nonmetal, those heavy metals generally occur in the transitional metal block of the periodic table. So you'll have to name the heavy metal, followed by a Roman numeral that represents the charge of that heavy metal. Then you write the nonmetal ending in IDE. So an example of this would be copper 2 chloride. And we know copper has a charge of 1 and 2. In this case, we've specified that it's copper 2 chloride. To write the formula, we can use the crisscross method as a quick little tool to determine how the charges of the atom crisscross to determine the subscripts of our compound. So you can see here, if we've got copper 2 plus and chlorine, which has a charge of 1 minus, we use the crisscross method, and the crisscross method allows us to determine the number of atoms that belong to each compound. So in this case, copper, and there's an imaginary 1 beside copper, and then we've got chloride, which has 2 chlorine atoms belonging to it. If you do come across numbers that can be reduced, reduce when needed. Now, when we're dealing with a metal plus a polyatomic ion, if we're dealing with an ionic compound still, to name it, you would name the metal first and then the polyatomic, especially if you're dealing with a soft metal. But as soon as you're dealing with that heavy metal, again, you've got to use the Roman numeral and then list your polyatomic ion. And last but not least, when we're dealing with a nonmetal, we are dealing with a covalent compound. Okay, so covalent compounds. And to name a covalent compound, it's a little more complicated, but we are first going to name the nonmetal, which is the cation, adding a necessary prefix. So we're using prefixes mono, di, tri, tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, octa, nona, and deca, or nona and deca. And the prefixes determine how many specific atoms of that element or atom there are. So you name the first nonmetal, followed by the second nonmetal, which is the anion, with its prefix, and then the second nonmetal must end in IDE. For instance, carbon tetrafluoride. To determine the formula of a covalent compound, you're going to count the number of atoms in each element and write the formula following the prefix numbers. So let's say we have carbon octafluoride. Well, if we're given carbon octafluoride, then we know that octa means 8, and carbon, although there's no mono in front of carbon, generally mono isn't used if we're dealing with the first nonmetal, so it would be called carbon octafluoride, CF8. So this is just a pretty simple foldable that allows you to practice naming your inorganic compounds.